Perot, the Associate Director at the Des Moines Art Center. I'm so pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Director and the Board of Trustees to this very special program called Architectural Trinity, 50 years of the Des Moines Art Center. Before we begin, I've asked if you could please hold your photographs to the end of our program. We'd really appreciate it. The Art Center's 50th anniversary year has provided an opportunity not only to celebrate and document its past achievements and community support, but to look forward and to envision the future. The Art Center's new director will guide this remarkable institution into that future. Ms. Talbot is tremendously respected in the museum community. She brings to Des Moines a national reputation earned through her thoughtful leadership. She's been responsible for innovative programs that advance the visual arts, and she's inspired enthusiasm and enduring support in the communities where she's worked. We look forward to an exciting future under her leadership. She just arrived in Des Moines and began her position on Thursday, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming her to this community. Our new director, Susan Talbot. Please stand. With Susan today is her daughter Maggie. Welcome. We all are truly excited and eager to work ahead. Many people have worked to bring this event to you today, and I'd like to sincerely thank the Iowa chapter of the American Institute of Architects, Drake University, Iowa State University, the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, and the Art Center staff for their support and dedication. It is also my pleasure to particularly recognize Cal Lewis. Cal, could you stand, please? Cal is a principal in Herbert Lewis Kruse Blunck Architecture in Des Moines. His patience, good humor, creative engagement in all aspects of the planning and organization of this program have been a source of inspiration for all of us who have had the good fortune to work with him. Without his unflagging efforts and generous collaboration, this program would not have come to fruition. So thank you very much. In a moment, Cal will introduce our distinguished panel of architects and moderate today's program. As noteworthy as the Art Center's collection is, the museum likewise boasts of an outstanding collection of architecture. And so to begin this program, we present to you a 5-minute video which chronicles the design of the museum that's become a unique architectural achievement admired in the museum profession. I hope that you'll enjoy it. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the Des Moines Art Center. My name is Elliot Nussbaum and I'm the architecture editor at Traditional Home magazine. You see before you a unique achievement in 20th century architecture, a collaboration by 3 of the most noteworthy architects of modern times, Eliel Saarinen, I.M. Pei, and Richard Meyer. The Edmund Trust was established in 1933 to pay for a new museum for Des Moines. But it wasn't until after World War II that plans for a new art museum really began to take shape. Eliel Saarinen first achieved fame in his native Finland and built upon that reputation after moving to the United States in 1923. It was his unbuilt design for the Smithsonian Art Gallery that first attracted local attention as the centerpiece of an exhibition in Des Moines organized by the Fine Arts Association in 1939. 5 years later, as the search for an architect to design the museum began in earnest, Eliel Saarinen was the only architect to receive serious consideration for the job. After several attempts, a final design for the museum was approved by the Board of Trustees on March 22, 1945, and Eliel Saarinen was commissioned as architect for the Des Moines Art Center. The accepted design was a distinctly modern building that would hug the ground rather than overwhelm the natural setting of the city's Greenwood Park. Saarinen's design called for a U-shaped organization of the galleries, foyer, and auditorium, with a separate wing-like extension for classrooms and studios. The U was to encircle a reflecting pool, and the classroom studio wing would frame the parking lot. The interiors offered large rambling spaces, starting with the spacious foyer and moving into the galleries. When the trustees of the Des Moines Art Center decided to build an addition to exhibit sculpture in 1966, they turned to I.M. Pei. Pei had already built an enviable reputation as an architect and was about to emerge as one of the most significant designers of museums in the world. Among Pei's best-known projects are the East Wing of the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and an addition and renovation of the Louvre in Paris. Pei's proposal was a wing built across the open end of Saturnin's U-shaped building on its south side. By choosing this gently sloping site, Pei was able to design a dramatic two-story gallery with a spectacular south-facing facade without overwhelming Saturnin's low-lying building. Pei's plan called for 3 sculpture exhibition areas, a large gallery on the main floor overlooking a two-story gallery on the lower level, and a small gallery at the west end of the main floor. An auditorium was designed for the space immediately under the main floor. Among the addition's more noteworthy architectural details are the 2 stairways connecting the main and lower level galleries. One is a wide open walkway, the other a tight circular stair that offers an intimate view to the park beyond. Also of note is the butterfly roof section that allows natural light to fill the remaining galleries and the dramatically sculpted walls enclosing the courtyard. As the collection and programs at the Des Moines Art Center grew in the 1970s and early 1980s, it became increasingly clear that the museum needed more exhibition space, especially for larger scale contemporary works, such as this untitled work by Anselm Kiefer. A competition to design a second addition to the Des Moines Art Center was held, and Richard Meyer was chosen from a group of internationally prominent architects. To meet the museum's need for an additional 28,000 square feet of space, without totally eclipsing Saturnin's original building, Meyer's plan called for dividing his addition into 3 parts: a restaurant meeting room in the courtyard, a small gallery on the west end of the Saturnin building, and a pavilion for the permanent collection and temporary exhibitions. Meyer used granite cladding for the first time in Des Moines to offset his signature white panels, and also set his addition on a granite base that is complementary to Saturnin's Lannenstone. The pavilion's highly sculptural exterior includes numerous cutouts and cutaways, enhancing the already dramatic geometry of the building while creating dynamic interior shapes as well as usable outdoor spaces in the voids. The same ideas can be seen on a much larger scale at the architect's recently completed Getty Museum outside Los Angeles. Now, when you visit the Des Moines Art Center to enjoy the museum's outstanding collection of art, I hope you'll also take this opportunity to enjoy the museum's outstanding collection of architecture.
The Des Moines Art Center, an uncommon vision. That's one of those wonderful titles that's rich with multiple meanings. First, there was the uncommon vision to locate the long-awaited new Art Center building in the beautiful setting of Greenwood Park over 50 years ago. Then, there was the uncommon vision of selecting the first architect and ultimately selecting the collection of architects who also each had an uncommon vision in both their individual work and their ability to become a part of a total setting. Even the art collection itself has had the uncommon vision to focus and become an extraordinary representation of contemporary art. Today, we honor the golden anniversary of this uncommon vision with a special program focused on the unique assemblage of architecture, which has created an architectural trinity over these first 50 years of the Des Moines Art Center. To assist us with those honors, we have created our own special assemblage of architectural expertise. They will review the issues and analyze the 3 generations of architectural responses that have gone into making the Des Moines Art Center such a significant piece of architecture. How significant is it? How did it take shape? Who and what were the influences? Could there be more in the future? Those are some of the questions we will be asking and hopefully answering today. As I introduce each speaker to you, I will not take the time to list the extraordinary professional, educational, and literary accomplishments that each one of them has assembled over their illustrious careers. Their tremendous insight into the subjects of today's discussion will be obvious as they each share their knowledge and sensitivity. Their expertise will range from a broad, inclusive background about art and architecture to the most intimate relationship of all, the creator of the work. Each of the 4 speakers will provide introductory remarks, and then I will join them on stage in a panel discussion that will open up opportunities for both the speakers and the audience to participate in a dialogue that will continue to inform us about the architects, the architecture, and the events that have brought us together for this celebration. Mr. Franz Schultz will be our first speaker today. He clearly represents the broad background appropriate to set the tone for today's discussion. Mr. Schultz is a renowned art critic, architectural historian, and professor emeritus in art at Lake Forest College in suburban Chicago. He was just completing his collegiate education at the Art Institute in Chicago soon after the original Des Moines Center building was opened. As an author, media correspondent, and teacher, his life has been devoted to the critical analysis of art and architecture. That is why the Art Center chose him to write the essay about their building in their newly released book, An Uncommon Vision. However, the real testimonial to his expertise comes from another connection. Nancy Robinson, Mr. Pay's valuable executive assistant, actually had Mr. Schultz as a professor when she was a student at Lake Forest College. She confided in me that he was the best teacher she ever had. So with that resounding endorsement, I would like you to help me welcome Mr. Franz Schultz.
Nancy, where are you? You know, coming as I do from Chicago, a city that is a notorious reputation for bad weather, and judging also from the size and the mood and the equanimity of this audience today, I have to give you Iowans credit for your fortitude in coming out to hear us all this afternoon. I think there's reason for you to do so because my colleagues, I think you will find, are altogether in command of the situation and of the subject that we're going to be talking about today. I'd like to begin this with remembering a conversation which I had with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine at Lake Forest College in the Department of Psychology, but a man who knows a great deal about art and music, and who had been out in Berkeley during the past summer and drove east to begin the school year in late August. And he told me, without knowing that I was involved in the Des Moines project, that he had stopped in Des Moines and visited the Art Center, having known very little about it up until that time, and been very, very impressed by what he saw. Not only by the collection, which itself derived a great deal of his applause, but also by the architecture. And he just mentioned that to me, and then I told him about what I was doing And he said, well, I can understand why, because I've, among small city museums, and I've seen quite a few of them, and I'm still quoting my friend, this is one of the best. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're all here together today, and what has actually prompted the anniversary celebration and this extraordinary book that accompanies the celebration. I have had, however, some misgivings about the title of the essay that I wrote, which I think is something called an architectural trinity. And I've been thinking about that. It is, after all, a metaphor taken from the Christian notion of the triune God of three persons in one, which is a paradox, obviously. And it seems to me that in theology, paradoxes work. I'm not sure they do in architecture. And that, in a sense, is what I'm here to mention. Because the essay itself, and most of the comments, including this video, quite rightly talk about the extraordinary collaboration between these three buildings. Forget the architects, between the three buildings. They work together very, very well. But at the same time, and I concluded this particularly this morning as I walked around the museum outside and in, that this was also the work of three very strong-willed, independent minds. Not one of them gave an inch to the other. So if it is a trinity, it is really three persons. The Saturn building, of course, being the first one, had already established its reputation by the time I.M. Pei took over in the late 1960s. He himself had a reputation which was worldwide, of course. We in Chicago remember him especially for that extraordinary design that he contributed to the Chicago Tribune competition, the Tower competition in 1922, which won the second prize in that competition, but which is taken by most historians to have been the best submission to that contest. And of course, he also did a number of other things in and around Chicago, or for Chicago, I should say, which were never built, much to our loss. We also, we were aware at the time, and Des Moines was, of course, of what he had done at Cranbrook Academy, and more on that in a few minutes. So that when he began this in the 1940s, in a way, this sort of thing had not been done before in America. You saw that entry that he won for the Smithsonian Art Gallery, which is obviously very, very much at odds with the sort of neoclassical look of Washington, D.C. at the time he designed it. Clearly a modernist building, and one that was regarded highly enough to have won the prize. And when he did the Des Moines Art Center, as I think you also are aware, he faced quite a bit of hostility among the trustees. They were not accustomed to that kind of museum. It flew in the face of all of the notions of a classical edifice, a kind of compact, oftentimes symmetrical building. In Saarinen case, the building tended to ramble somewhat. It was innocent of most of the classical paraphernalia that one associated with buildings, with civic buildings, with museum buildings. And of course, obviously, some people on the board found that, or took a hostile attitude toward it. We should be grateful, of course, that the people pushed through it, and that Saarinen won the day in that case. And what was left for when Mr. Pei came by to add to it was a building which today itself, it seems to me, exudes a quality of refinement, and if I may say so, a kind of delicacy. The materials are rich, they are warm. The scale is small and low, although I must say, as I went through the galleries today, the height of the galleries is beautiful as far as the works are concerned. And the use of ornament, that very sparing use of ornament that Saarinen used far more, it seems to me, than some of his contemporaries, also impressed me tremendously. Then comes Pei. And what he gave us, we've heard a good deal about the way, for example, in which the surfaces of Mr. Pei's walls, this bush-hammered concrete, is meant to jibe, to work together with the Lannenstone of the Saarinen buildings. And that's all true. And certainly his pays respect for the one-story height of the Saarinen building is, again, accurate. But there is no mistaking the building for that Mr. Pei put up. It's a marvel, in my estimation, of functionalism, as well as aesthetics. When you stand there at the edge of the reflecting pool and you look across at that facade, which is splendidly large scaled, which is appropriate to the kind of work that went into it, because large sculpture was one of the major rationales for the construction of the building. You see these huge spaces, and then this one wonderful, sort of cylindrical projection that comes out, violating the otherwise straight rectilinearity of the thing, but acting as a wonderful counterfoil. That I found masterful, especially when you go inside the building and you realize that that is a staircase that leads from one balcony down to the other, and that there are two balconies in the building, despite the fact that he is respectful, and I think in this case the respect is appropriate, to the one-story height of the Saarinen building. The spaces inside, seen from without, especially I suppose it's the south facade, where particularly at night, when the light flows through those heavy lintels and beams, and you get an image that reminds you somewhat of Mondrian's paintings, all of these things contribute to the quality of that work. So you have Saarinen and you have Pei, two, I repeat, very different architects, each working to his own advantage, his own scheme, and at the same time somehow working together well. Richard Meyer added to this in 1983, and I think it is safe to say that he was, in fact, I have a statement here, if I may just say this, read this very briefly to you, from Meyer, comments by himself, a couple of sentences. He said, "When I first visited the Des Moines Art Center and toured the original Edel Saarinen building and the subsequent I.M. Pei addition, I was struck by the wonderful scale relationship which the Art Center had to the site, as well as by the respect that this Pei addition had to the older Saarinen building." And then he goes on to say that any single addition to the museum would be somewhat problematic. It seemed to him that the imposition of smaller pieces were needed, so that in order that and I believe this was mentioned in the video, that any one single addition would not overwhelm the existing buildings. And I think he was remarkably successful in that regard too. Those three pavilions that he's added, very much in keeping with his own style. When you look at this building, you know that's Richard Meyer. The porcelain exterior, that granite block of the porcelain girds, all of these things suggest that that man was likewise an independent person. So that's basically the key signature of my remarks, that you do have here a building which deserves the kind of credit that it has received nationally and internationally, that the architects that contributed to it are people of extraordinary scope, ambition, and accomplishment. At the same time, they remain themselves. One last thought, if I may, and that is to remind us all that the building is 50 years old, and that back in the 1940s, this modernism that I spoke of earlier was still very, very new. The great European architects who, for the most part, had brought modernism to the United States, I'm thinking of people like Gropius and Mies and Marcel Breuer, had barely gotten here. As far as Mies is concerned, and I think Papademetriou will say a few things about the relationship between the Saarinens and Mies. Mies himself was in Chicago, had been there since 1938, but had not yet built anything. There was, of course, the war years, and it required him until late in the 1940s before his buildings went up. All the more reason to credit Saarinen with being very close to the cutting edge of architecture at the time. Now, to finish off, and this time to return to the idea of the Trinity. Saarinen worked in the 40s, Pei in the 60s, Meyer in the 80s. You have a generational difference. You have two people here speaking about Saarinen, Mr. Bacon and Mr. Papademetriou. You have Mr. Pei himself speaking for himself. Mr. Meyer is not here. So you have, it seems to me, given the generational differences, Father, Son, Holy Ghost.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. As the current graduate school program director and professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, Mr. Peter Papademetriou also comes with tremendous credentials as an author, correspondent, critic, and teacher. In my search for someone with the knowledge of the work of Eliel Saarinen, the architect of the original building, I contacted Mr. Kevin Roach, who had begun working in the Saarinen firm around 1950, and who was a partner in the firm of Roach and Dinkeloo, the evolution of the Saarinen firm. Without hesitation, he recommended Mr. Peter Papademetriou as the only possible choice. In addition to his detailed research and writings on Mr. Saarinen, several years ago, he had helped organize a reunion of Saarinen alumni at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, the architectural home base of the Saarinens. Would you please help me welcome Mr. Peter Papademetriou.
Good afternoon. I would like to ask your indulgence while I thank a few people. Firstly, it's a pleasure to be back here in Des Moines once again, and most particularly on the occasion of the celebration of the golden anniversary of the Des Moines Art Center. It's also a pleasure to be speaking here on the Drake University campus, given the important position many of these buildings represent in the career of Eero Saarinen. And I always thought that Eero was the father, Kevin was the son, and Eliel was the Holy Ghost, but I guess it depends on your point of view. I've entitled my remarks today, Saarinen versus Saarinen, to discuss the position of the planning and first phase designs for the Des Moines Art Center and the professional work of the Saarinens and the development of modern architecture in America. If I could have the lights and slide. Great. I don't know if you all can see those. If you can bring the lights down a little bit more, maybe that'll be better. Eliel Saarinen and Eero Saarinen shared the exact same date of birth, August 20th, 1873 and 1910. They both had international recognition in the same career as architects. They both married twice. They both had a son and daughter, and they were and are very likely to remain the only father-son duo who were both recipients in the history of the gold medal of the American Institute of Architects. Eliel Saarinen, father, began his second career as an architect in America in 1923 at the age of 50. Eero Saarinen, son, ended an emerging career in 1961, just after his 50th birthday, when he died of an undetected brain tumor. Eliel and Eero Saarinen reflect not only the dualities, but ultimately a dichotomy of what we might call style, whose common features and divergencies manifest the transitions between what we call modern architecture in America. Where does the Edmondson Memorial Museum, the Des Moines Art Center, now also having marked its 50th birthday, fit into this critical history of American modernism? For Des Moines, it represents a cultural beginning, a bringing of modernism as a fitting representation, as Professor Schulze has suggested, to a public institution. It also reflects the careers of the Saarinens in marking both an end and a beginning. The period of Des Moines' inception through construction, 1943 to 48, was a critical time in which the young acorn of Eero Saarinen began to emerge from the shadow of the great oak tree of Eliel Saarinen. And it was a period in which modernism in America itself began to come of age. While he had become a prominent architect in his native Finland, a severe economic depression following independence from Russia after World War I prompted Eliel, at age 49, to enter an international competition for the Chicago Tribune Tower, as Professor Schultz mentioned. And here's a picture of his second prize winning entry, which was a tapering silhouette defining the tall building. By the way, there are no tall buildings in Finland. It was an American invention, and he defined it for Americans, enhancing his international reputation. With the substantial prize money that he got, Elio came to America in 1923, followed by his family in mid-year. The great event in Elio Saarinen's career as an architect came while he was a visiting professor in the University of Michigan, 1924 to 25. And that, by the way, is Eero in the foreground in the studio at the University of Michigan. Two young men in this special class were J. Robert F. Swanson, who was to become his son-in-law, and Henry Scripps Booth, son of George G. Booth, publisher of the Detroit News. Swanson and Booth had opened a small practice and in part were working on elements of a private dream of the elder Booth that was to be the creation of a collection of educational and artistic institutions at Cranbrook outside Detroit, Michigan. This shows the extent of Cranbrook. The girls' school, the art academy, the boys' school, and the Institute of Science, which has recently had an addition built by Stephen Hull. Elio was invited to undertake a master plan for a series of institutions, a project that lasted 2 decades. Both the elder Booth and the elder Saarinen found what they were looking for. Booth got an architect who was willing to listen to a client's ideas and who shared a vision of integration of arts and crafts. And Saarinen got a client who was ready to pay for a project combining planning and architecture. Elio's work at Cranbrook underwent a transitional evolution during this period. With the early Cranbrook School for Boys, begun in 1926, Elio demonstrated a skill at combining two seemingly contradictory design aesthetics, the picturesque and the classical. You can see that here, where the dormitories, which are very English country looking, are actually defining an axis, particularly with these two chimneys that form a central axis to be terminated at the end of that vista. These medievalizing tendencies are more generalized and combined together by means of classicizing moves, such as these axial alignments. By 1929, in the Kingswood School for Girls, he had exhibited simplified massing and more sparing use of ornamental variety. The abstract spirit was at once Art Deco and related to the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, in addition to symbolic metaphorical notes associated with a school for girls, such as the extensive use of these stepped, flared columns, seen perhaps as abstracted floral ornaments. In his final year of high school, the young Eero began his collaboration with his father, working for the Cranbrook Architectural Office in 1928 to 29. In the fall of 29, immediately before the Great Crash, Eero left for Paris to study sculpture at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière with Émile Bourdelle. Bourdelle died shortly after his arrival, but there is strong evidence to suggest that Eero completed at least a portion of his study with the sculptor Aristide Maillot. Both artists, Bourdelle and Maillot, were from the atelier of Rodin, and their work was considered to be quite modern, although rooted in the works of classical tradition. They were also both interested in the integration of art and architecture, an interest which Eero had pursued and executed in several works, such as ornamental details at the Cranbrook School for Boys and an architectural lighting element in the main stair of Kingswood. You can see the sort of Pegasus at the top of the stairs. After his return to Cranbrook, Eero developed furniture designs in 1930 to 31, which concurrently embraced both the most avant-garde references as well as the most traditional. By the way, these are Eero's photographs. His auditorium armchair for Kingswood is a modernist steel tube frame with a cantilevered seat in the manner of Marge Stamm, Marcel Breuer, or Alvar Aalto. The dining room chair, by contrast, is the traditional wood frame of natural and pink painted birch with reproduction linen upholstery. In 1931, Elio Saarinen was invited to speak at the annual convention of the American Institute of Architects in San Antonio, Texas, on his personal philosophy. He advocated a cautionary modernism, noting that, quote, revolution is only evolution at more speed. The progressive part is the motor, which gives the speed. The conservative part is the brake, which prevents accidents. I see only evolution. And are we going to build our contemporary architecture in forms that do not mean anything? No. 3 exclamation points. Eero entered the Graduate School of Fine Arts at Yale in the fall of 1931, having never attended undergraduate college, and became known to his classmates as Second Medal Saarinen for his consistent record in the National Design Awards programs of the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design. His projects exhibit a degree of clarity which made them attractive. This Spearing Prize that he won in its sculptural directness of a memorial tunnel entrance, where the jury noted quote, by simply scooping out the rock in a semicircle at the tunnel entrance for a great height and cutting back huge steps in the face of the mountain either side, produces a approach monumental though primitive in character and as enduring as the mountain itself. His thesis of 1934, a scheme to bring the Stevens Institute of Technology into more compact and efficient relations, is organized along monumental lines, dominated by a step tower derived from Eliel's Tribune Tower design. Upon graduation, Saarinen was awarded both a traveling fellowship from Yale and a silver medal for having the greatest number of design medals. With this, he traveled to Europe, visiting both the historical sites and examples of a new modernism. These are from his photographs of that period in Vienna and in Italy, looking at the then new fascist architecture. A return to Finland also brought Eero in more direct contact with changes in aesthetic temperament reflected in Scandinavian versions of functionalism, and its particular interpretations of the international style, especially the work of Gunnar Asplund in Sweden, Alvar Aalto, who had moved to Helsinki by then from Jyväskylä and completed the Paimio Sanatorium in 1933 in the Viipuri Library in 1935, both of which Eero saw. These works delved into perceived changes in technology and aesthetic representation, but reflected a critically non-ideological attitude, one more broadly based in its references, and which Peter Smithson has characterized in Aalto's case as being untheoretical, non-revolutionary, and unheroic. As young Eero worked on renovations and additions to the Swedish theater in Helsinki with an uncle, Jarl Eklund, who was also advancing designs originally proposed by his father, Eliel, his many facade studies suggest that while he had one foot in the past, these are drawings by Eero Saarinen, Eero was struggling to find an architecture of and for the future. Here's a version in the international style. One such study, if you can look in the lower right-hand corner, features a doodle of Pappy Saarinen glowering over his son's efforts. A little comment on where he's going. In late 1936, a practice was initiated outside of the work of the Cranbrook Architectural Office as Eliel Saarinen and Eero Saarinen. In the 5 years which followed, projects were executed under a variety of collaborations and began to suggest the presence of younger minds from the Cranbrook community. In 1934 to 38, Cranbrook undertook its Institute of Science, which was reflected a modern sensibility, abstracted form, articulation of program through massing, and the dynamic cantilever of the thin portico slab, for example, are examples of this modern tendency. A previously unknown design of 1937 for a residence in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, the Coble House, which was actually the first job that carried the office outside of Cranbrook, with its horizontal strip banding, was a provocative modernistic design for a traditional conservative Grosse Pointe. The more sedate version was actually completed by son-in-law Robert Swanson. The Fenton Community Center of the same year continues this combination of Eliel motifs with an approach of greater simplicity. Eero was clearly pushing for the inclusion of more advanced motifs, resisting the use of carved stone lettering, as noted in a letter dated August 20, 1937, stating, quote, Mr. Saarinen's man Weber advises that young Mr. Saarinen is still very anxious to have metal lettering used, unquote. As the Fenton project was winding down, Eero was invited by a Yale graduate several years his senior, Worthing Paxton, of the office of Norman Bell Geddes, to participate in the design of the General Motors Pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair. Eero was primarily responsible for the building concept of enclosing the Futurama show, an exercise in streamlining design which had been virtually invented by Bell Geddes. Its sculptural aspects are obvious, but it also appeared as a possible way of giving form to contemporary technology. While in the Bell Geddes office, Eero also placed fifth in an entry to the Wheaton College Art Center competition, organized as a modernist pinwheel composition. You can see here the beginnings of these wings going in all directions, something quite antithetical to Eliel. Later in 1938, in collaboration with his father, Eliel, he placed second in a design for Goucher College campus plan and library competition, whose site planning combines the classical lines of Eliel with asymmetrical and continuous spatial ideas. The same elements were shown in the first place entry for a festival theater and fine arts building at the College of William and Mary of 1939, which he did with architect Ralph Rapson. whose centripetal composition echoes Bauhaus concepts. This expansive geometry contrasts with the more centralized classical vocabulary which characterized Eliel Saarinen's planning designs at Cranbrook. It's after this period that the Saarinen practice exhibits a continuing presence of modernism, although the range of influences reflects their clients, with traditional references more often associated with Eliel, while modernist designs exhibit Arrow's emerging belief in technological determinism. Others in the office during these early years, 1938 to 41, included a number of Cranbrook people, as I mentioned, Ralph Rapson, also designer Charles Eames. The 1938 to 40 Kleinhans Auditorium for Buffalo, New York, a job that Eames worked on, was the first major work to win national recognition. And while its outward form suggests the classicism of Eliel, the somewhat streamlined plan and its interiors, specifically the furniture, are more progressively modern. It was this representational aspect which disturbed critics such as Joseph Hudnut, dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, by then home of former Bauhaus master Walter Gropius, who wrote critically in 1941 in July Architectural Forum of, quote, "a new eloquence of architecture, the sources of which are those necessities that underlie and direct its outward form. All parts are coordinated to give a sense of a single organism. This is the thrilling fact about modern architecture. The adjustments and distortions of the modern architect are made not in the interest of a general harmony of forms, but a harmony of energies. It is a pity, I think, that these meanings could not have been made more evident on the exterior forms of the building. I should have preferred a functional form. This defeat of an organic unity is not compensated for by that warmth in texture and color, that perfection in detail, that serene candor which, continued here, have always sustained the great and just renown of Eliel Saarinen," unquote. This admiration, yet criticism for the Saarinens, predicted a separation of father from son. But all the while, the non-ideological base of their work and the Saarinen program at Cranbrook, free as it was of dogma, could comfortably fit a variety of significant modernist personalities, such as Frank Lloyd Wright, and also Le Corbusier, who basically hated each other. But they loved Eliel Saarinen. At the same time, as Professor Schultz has suggested, the Smithsonian Gallery of Art competition of '39 further established the Saarinen office as a modernist firm. It was a national competition. It was extremely controversial, you can imagine. In a team which included, on the left, brother-in-law Robert Swanson, in the middle, Eliel, and on the right, Arrow, as well as Charles Eames. Arrow really took the design direction by rationally exploring elements of program to establish relationships rather than the predetermined formal image. Functional areas were closely arranged, but clearly and separately articulated, and a degree of aformalism was suggested by certain components open to future expansion. Motifs such as the long horizontal expanses of glass, precise, thin-walled, contained volumes, and open flexible spaces organized around a consistent module are modern. But these are tempered by applied decoration, a careful balanced composition of the volumes, the formal element of the reflecting pool, and a certain degree of monumentalism and dignified restraint, which is reflective of Eliel Saarinen. Eliel's designs for the Boston Symphony's summer home at Tanglewood, this is the scheme of 1937, continue these more classical themes, while in 1941, Arrow was exploring the uses of technology and an architecture related to an expression of the evocation of program. His opera house for Tanglewood had a roof system which was an exercise in tensile structure, in turn hung in suspension from the then innovative laminated wood arch beams, facilitating an internal clear span. Its materials also suggest the barn vocabulary of rural Massachusetts. This period, 1939 to 1941, was one of intense collaboration between Arrow and Charles Eames. Both taught at Cranbrook, with Eames in charge of the design department and Arrow a special lecturer in architecture. Their design for the 1939 Cranbrook faculty exhibition, which was housed in an Albert Kahn interior, demonstrates their design commitment to technological expression. The planar display panels, that's planar display panels, tensile rods which grid the space, cantilever bases are all an exercise in extracting the most dynamic possibilities from materials reduced to their lightest, most efficient, quote-unquote, form. A famous portrait of the two collaborators, I'm sure you've seen this picture, shows them poised on what is actually a plywood pedestal base supported by diagonal wood dowels, an ultimate example of this faith in the strength of modern materials. The base actually held a model of the Kleinhans Music Hall. At the same time, the Cranbrook Academy Library and Museum of 1940 to 43, designed independently by Eliel Saarinen, while described in the architectural press as the last modern art museum built before World War II, was compositionally, materially, and representationally from an era passing into that of the period piece. Wartime brought the formation of a new office, Saarinen and Swanson, and national recognition for defense housing planning and housing design, such as an inclusion in the Museum of Modern Art 1942 exhibition, Wartime Housing. During the war years, 43 to 45, while Eero Saarinen served as a civilian in the Office of Strategic Services, a small office of Saarinen and Swanson was maintained in Washington, D.C. While it was primarily involved in the defense housing project, several additional projects continued these new themes. Eero executed the community house project for the U.S. Gypsum Company before joining the OSS in 1941. The design was a, quote, demountable space, modular building based on a central mast with tensile roof hung from that mast. Its facade reflected an indeterminate program of a variety of purposes for post-war communities. It could be extended, its composition reconfigured, while services were treated as a kind of plug-in, prefabricated element. The Unfolding House of 1943, another Saarinen project for the Kellett Aircraft Corporation and the Knoll Design Group, proposed factory-made trailer units which could combine together. With his colleague from the OSS, Oliver Lundquist, Saarinen won first place in the Designs for Post-War Living competition sponsored by Arts and Architecture magazine, with another factory-produced, pre-assembled component service core which could combine together in alternative arrangements. This was a compositionally aformal, open-ended, lightweight, industrial-inspired, technologically advanced architecture. During this period, the Saarinen and Swanson office pursued a series of more real-world projects, including the beginning of the Des Moines Art Center. This picture is in Professor Schulze's essay in the book, which is for sale out in the lobby. I was paid to say that. Whose first phase designs exhibit the classical planning motifs and monumentality of the elder Saarinen. These are some of these illustrations are both in the book and in the exhibition, which is in the Des Moines Art Center. You can see the scale of this courtyard. It was like a 4-story building at the time. In some ways, the compositional strategies employed in the subsequent scaling down and massing as reflective of programmatic requirements. This is a sketch from 1945 by Eliel showing the new scheme. Suggests that those that had been introduced by the younger designers of Eero and his friends. Its exterior embraces the traditional and recalls the critical remarks made 5 years earlier by Joseph Hudnut, while its methods of construction are techniques far removed from those investigations of the younger Saarinen. This is showing the line and stone wall being constructed, and it is a wet, handmade, almost primitive system of construction compared to where Eero was at that time. The Fort Wayne, Indiana Art School and Museum of 1945 to 46 bears a strong similarity to the final scheme for Des Moines, including its plan. Even the massing is very similar to Des Moines, unbuilt project. And the final scheme for the Flint, Michigan First Baptist Church of 46 evokes both those pinwheel planform configurations as well as the more serene, stripped classical motifs of Eliel's work, as seen in the First Christian Church of Columbus, Indiana of 1939 to 42, this drawing by Eliel Saarinen. In Des Moines, Drake University had also become an example of the evolving transitions in the Saarinen design strategies. Early master plan studies commencing in 1946 joined a series of campus schemes coming out of the office in that decade. This is from a very large article published in the 1946 Architectural Record magazine, featuring the Drake University campus. For those of you that are students might be interested in looking this up. That's the original plan, very similar to the sorts of things that Eliel was doing, axes, groupings of buildings to form connections and cross axes and so on. While they both embody and enhance the principles of planning closely associated with Eliel in the Cranbrook Architecture Department, their compositional and spatial qualities seem to be dated at this time. By the end of the war, the Saarinen office was nationally known, and the singularity of Eliel's prominence was replaced by the influence of Eero as a co-equal. The partnership with Robert Swanson, which had been formalized in 1941, continued in 46 under the names Saarinen, Swanson, and Saarinen. Talk about trinities. but was to be terminated a year later in 1947 as the practice became Saarinen and Associates and a second firm, Swanson Associates. The most important element in this transition was the project for the General Motors Tech Center, announced in 1945. The first proposal is critical as it suggests in many ways the end of certain preoccupations as well as the beginning in continuity of others. Certainly the presence of the large formal element of the lake, like another reflecting pool, and the interplane of horizontal forms punctuated by vertical elements have precedent in their collaborative work. However, the overall feeling is functionalist in the kind of industrialized campus organized in principles evoked by the 1939 City of Tomorrow at Norman Bell Getty's Futurama. Perspective by Aero, shown here, emphasizes the continuity of movement by a continuous canopy podium. This theme was developed further in 47, and as the buildings themselves were designed, greater affinity may be seen with the industrialized projects Aero had done in the 1940s. These drawings by Hugh Ferris. And the streamlining he encountered while at Bell Getty's was imposing an image from which he sought a means to express the essence of modernism in a new cultural context. A second version of GM followed after the project had been stopped for nearly half a year by a major union strike. And its revised organization and approach to individual buildings repudiated those of the earlier schemes and reflected principles of Bauhaus Chicago architect Mies van der Rohe in his plans for the Illinois Institute of Technology. But in contrast to the more static, nearly neoclassical groupings at IIT, evidenced a dialectic interplay between objectivity and romantic subjectivity, such as this phase, which contained an office building directly on the lake. The debt to Mies is clear from a letter Aero Saarinen deliberately wrote on Thanksgiving Day in 1948, expressing his thanks to Mies for a tour of IIT. He observed, "I feel your buildings at Illinois Tech will have a tremendous impact on American architecture from now on. I think it will be a most positive force. The message of complete honesty and integrity which they carry should set off re-examination of values in the mind of many an architect, including my own." And you can see how the plan developed. Mies thought enough of Saarinen's work that he invited him to give the dedication address for the opening of his own Crown Hall at IIT. When Aero Saarinen appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1956, it was the plan of General Motors, which was the background image, and the theme of the issue entitled Maturing Modern. Saarinen in turn began to employ these precise spatial principles in other work, such as subsequent refinements of the Drake campus plan. You can see the Mies influence here. And in the evolution of dormitories number 4 and dining hall, Henriette Hall and Hubble Hall, shown in plans of 1946, the sort of boomerang version, and then in 56, the built version, the Miesian version. While Time magazine heralded the Des Moines Art Center as the first modern art museum built after World War II, the July 1949 issue of the Architectural Forum magazine quite possibly tells it most clearly. The opening or lead article is the Des Moines Art Center, shown here, perhaps in no small way due as a deferential nod to the senior Saarinen, who in fact was about a year away from his own death in 1950. The lead page. What is telling, however, is the cover of the magazine, which features the new designs for the General Motors Tech Center, whose visual themes are generally acknowledged as being from the junior Saarinen. This careful partitioning of the two Saarinens, yet the dichotomous balancing, reflects the formal distance between father and son by 1950. In a 1959 letter written by Peggy Patrick of the Des Moines Art Center, addressed to the office requesting some images for use in a Des Moines educational program, Aline Saarinen, former New York Times art critic and wife of Aero, drew a firm line, lest there be any further confusion, directing the secretary, quote, "Please write a gracious letter pointing out that the Des Moines Art Center is by Eliel Saarinen, and do they want pictures of his work?" Aero Saarinen's initial belief in modernism had been firm, and he both echoed and expanded upon his father as he stated, quote, "Within our own time, it is more a matter of expansion than change. The principle of functional integrity seems to be one of the keystone principles of modern architecture. Structural integrity and structural clarity were basic principles." However, he also declared, "Today's buildings fail utterly by not even recognizing the spiritual side of architecture and the greater spiritual meaning of architecture to our civilization." His search for an American modern architecture was to become one which sought to synthesize the spiritual dimension within technologically advanced form. In 1948, again concurrent with the completion of the Des Moines project, both Saarinen submitted entries to the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial Competition in St. Louis. The apocryphal story goes that the contemporary telegram arrived addressed to Eliel Saarinen, congratulating him for the award. But a day later, a second telegram arrived clarifying that it was actually Eero Saarinen who was the winner. The search for form had at last been rewarded. His so-called St. Louis arch synthesized the qualities of abstraction, monumentality, and structural daring with a stainless steel arch form derived from the logical geometry of a catenary curve, eventually designed to be 630 feet in height. Possibly the greatest public monument produced in the period of modern architecture, it is also metaphorical in its allusions, consciously symbolizing the idea of the gateway to the West, combining technological determinism with symbolic representation. As Peter Carter observed, Eero Saarinen was aware of today's technology in its widest sense, and he used its potential as a means of achieving a many-faceted architectural expression within the tradition of the modern masters. To advance the symbolic and environmental content of that tradition, he explored special architectural vocabularies for each project. It precluded the possibility of a personal style, a fact which set him apart from many of his contemporaries. This is Eero on a mock-up of the stairs leading from the St. Louis Arch to the Mississippi River, constructed in the back of his office building in Michigan. And as Kenneth Frampton has suggested, this direction as an approach where minimalism exploits both the sensational and the mute nature of modern production, a silence that can be neither masked nor significantly transcended. The imperative task of the architect today is to master the means of production, not only for the sake of regaining control over the act of building, but also, presumably, so as to participate consciously in the production of meaning. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Papademetriou. Mr. Edmund Bacon also comes with a broad set of credentials as architect, city planner, author, and educator. His awards and recognition have made him one of the highest profile planners of his generation. His name is synonymous with the planning of his home city of Philadelphia. One of his books, Design of Cities, gave the first awareness of the issues and significance of city planning to a whole generation of architects, including me. I still remember the clear, simple diagrams that helped me understand the historic organization of cities that I saw in his book. When he comes up here, you may also recognize the resemblance to the actor Kevin Bacon, who happens to be Mr. Bacon's son, except Kevin is not as good looking. However, the real reason he's here is that he may be the only man to have worked with all three of the architects who are part of the Des Moines Art Center building, Saarinen, Pei, and Meyer. More importantly, he is the one person who can share personal insight into Eliel Saarinen, the original architect. Mr. Bacon was awarded a graduate fellowship in city planning at Cranbrook Academy of Art in 1935 and considers Mr. Saarinen his mentor. Mr. Bacon will share his unique experience with us today. Please help me welcome him.
Boy, wouldn't Kevin love that. Can you imagine working with all those three guys and surviving? Well, I did, but I'm in certain ways torn apart at this moment because it's perfectly true. I did live at Cranbrook for 1 solid year, and of course, all of you that live in Des Moines, you have this experience every day, but it was unique for me that every moment of everywhere I went, it was all harmonious and beautiful. And it does have its disadvantages, though, Professor Schultz. You spoke about the sensitivity to details and elegance. Well, in the art museum, you enter through those incredibly embracing arms of Saarinen into a beautiful, beautiful room. But it's incredibly simple, and it has only very perfectly balanced, simple paneling and a marvelous doorway. And because I lived there, I have a sensitivity to the whole business, and it's all got to work together. Now, in Saarinen's architecture, he had a wonderful wife called Loya, and she was a wonderful weaver of textiles. And so, beside the door, the two great doors you see when you come in are supposed to be beautiful textiles, and they're stinking lousy plastic things up and down.
So much for maintenance.
Now, I'm telling you, you've got to do better. My God, you do all that money for art and you wreck the environment by your plastic slats. But I really wanted to come here because it is true that I knew this man and I lived in this environment. But the thing about Cranbrook was that wherever you went, it was only and simply these great geniuses of Eliel and, of course, the wonderful sculptor that collaborated with him, Carl Millis, and the Loya and the magnificent textiles. And so it was these three essential elements, and it was everywhere. Now I come here, and I see what you did. And here is the wonderful, wonderful Saarinen, but by golly, there's Pei and there's Meyer. Well, let's see. It is absolutely true. Well, first of all, Yomin, I must say to you that as far as my own development is concerned, what I really learned was by your country in China. And in your country, I learned the secret that is everything that I do, and that is this, that architecture is not objects at all. Architecture is the sequential stimulation of your sensory responses to your environment with the musical sequence. And simply knowing that, I get myself in a completely different area. But then I went to work with Eliel, and Eliel just taught me wonderful things. The trouble with Eliel was that the things he taught me were so wonderful that they're not easy to discuss. And one thing he taught me was that architecture is not concerned with individual properties. It's concerned with the relationship between space and mass. And a harmonic relationship between space and mass does not stop at the border of a site. It goes on and on outward into the horizon as a continuous harmonious symphony of harmony of space and mass. And the other thing he said was that you take the form of a tree. A form of a tree is not a cone or a cylinder or a sphere. The form of the tree is the point of equilibrium between two great forces in the earth. And one is the impulse of the seed which you put in the ground, which is the impulse to create. And if unchecked, the impulse of a single seed to create would spread outward and would cover the whole universe. However, there also is the requirement for correlation. And that means that you've got to be able to translate the nutrients from the outer edge of the roots through and up through the trunk of the tree. And it's so marvelous that you have to go up through the trunk with these little tubes all exactly parallel. Then suddenly the discipline of parallelism is sequentially released, and they spread out from each other in a great form. And that this requirement to conduct the food up to the outermost edge is the restraining force, and that the form of the tree is the point of equilibrium between a force moving outward and the requirements of correlation. And I have a little, Hal, are you there? I've got a little slide thing here. This is a view of a tree on my son Kevin's property in Connecticut. And here you will see the painting which I had done of the tree in its very early spring. You will see it. This is my, oh, by the way, these are gravestones down there. Kevin has a graveyard for a neighbor. You see the form of the tree, and it's all structure. And, well, what's wrong? Well, hell, it's supposed to dissolve, didn't it? Well, what's going to... See, this is the form of a tree as form, but it is, if you conceive it as the consequence of the two forces it's an entirely different kind of animal. And now this is supposed to go back again, but it seems to not to do what it's... Was it all over? Well, we had a rehearsal of this. I don't know, it was very good. Well, anyway, you can imagine. Put the goddamn my son.
Here you go. They're teasing us.
Well, it was a good idea. I mean, you are really wild people here. When I was a kid, I assembled, little boy, I assembled three elements. One was sulfur, and one was, what is it, nitrogen? No, that is not right. What was the other chemical? And then we burned matches for charcoal. But we moved them together, we mixed them together, and then we put a match to them, and they exploded. And so that makes me think, you crazy. Well, now put the lights on for the people, because I haven't got any, I'd rather see you than nothing. But it is really a wild and astounding thing that you did. I mean, really most extraordinary. To get the most extraordinary man, Elio Saturn, and then stick Yoming Pei next to him, and then Richard Meyer. But Pei and I actually have a marvelous history. I don't need this thing at all, but he and I in Philadelphia created one of the really great and marvelous things that was ever done, and that is the plan for Society Hill. And when I did the plan for Society Hill, before the architects even started work, we made a full model of exactly what we wanted in great detail, and then we said to the architects, now this is what we want you to carry out. And of course the other architects all completely ignored everything about what we proposed, but Pei extraordinarily accepted part of what we did. Where are these lights? Down there. Pei accepted what we did. Yoming, do you know that the idea of in Society Hill having three beautiful towers was originated in a conversation between Mr. Zeckendorf and my assistant, Willow van Moltke? Did you know that? Well, anyway, it's true. So that our plan had three beautiful towers, but we wrapped a 6-story apartment house between the low, beautiful 18th century houses, which were 3 stories high. And Pei said, Bacon, you are a lousy architect. Your plan is awful. And he said, what did he do? he completely obliterated the 6-story apartments, and he extended the texture of the wonderful 18th century 3-story high, and then made the whole 3 towers a little bit bigger, so it went absolutely clear from this to that. And I said, hooray for you, you improved my own plan. And that is very unusual.
And that's pretty unusual.
You see, there's another little story I have to tell about him because he's here. Well, he put this courtyard around his low houses, and he put a circle in it of concrete, and he put a few little plants sticking up out of that. And it all looked pretty bare and barren. And I said to him, man, you ought to plant more trees in there. And then I came about 2 months later, and there were trees planted along like that. And I said, isn't he wonderful? And it was it's the people that lived there that did it themselves. He had nothing to do with it. You see, this is all a major build-up. Richard Meyer, I did want to make one little comment that it to me is very interesting as you move from one to the other of these interiors, that Saturn in his gallery completely abdicated his ego, and he made spaces which were totally anonymous and which could respond to any kind of exhibit. Pei came along, and he made his own architecture, a work of art, sculpture itself, which is an entirely different thing. But by golly, he did it well, which is extraordinary. And in his great gallery, it is true that the stairway, the shapes, the amazing roof. By the way, his plan reminds me of the imperial palaces of the Forbidden City in Beijing a little bit. And but however, it does work. That there are wonderful, wonderful spaces for the piece of architecture. Richard Meyer, I mostly remember the architecture. I have some trouble remembering what's in it. But anyway, the point of this was that, the point of this is one thing, and now I'm going to be through after this. And here I'm in very dangerous territory, and it's very delicate, but I've got to go through it anyway, because I sort of feel that Elio might like it, that Elio's original plan was so beautiful that you came in through the wonderful embracing doors, and you came into a space which had outreaching arms like this, and which embraced the whole of nature going off into the distance. And it reminded me a little bit of the wonderful Jefferson plan for the University of Virginia, where he had the central, as you know, Dominical Library, and then the wonderful professors' houses that went out and embraced the space, and then it extended right down the central axis to the hill and right in the distance. And the beginning of this century, with this sense of completeness, of finishedness, you know that McKinley's White came along and plugged off the entire view. With its beautiful architecture, but it's the whole concept of and also in all in history and so on. But I have trouble with you plugging off the damn connection. Now, I know it's beautiful architecture, and damn it, you could perfectly well make the circulation. Well, that's the answer.
Now you can tell where Kevin gets it from. Mr. I.M. Pei is truly the premier architect of the world. No other architect of his generation has generated the body of work or received the worldwide recognition of Mr. Pei. His Art Center projects alone, from the Miho Museum in Japan to the Louvre in Paris, represent unique and sensitive solutions to monumental architectural challenges. The passion and devotion that Mr. Pei has for his work is incomparable. That is why many years ago, he gave up publicly speaking about his work in favor of spending his valuable time doing the work itself. That is one of the reasons why having him join us here today is such an extraordinary opportunity. It is his first return to visit Des Moines in 30 years since the completion of the addition. The construction of that addition, which was, the construction of that addition, which was completed in 1968, fortunately, that time corresponded to the early years of my architectural education at Iowa State University, and my classmates and I would make architectural pilgrimages to the construction site. We were able to watch firsthand a lesson in the sensitivity, another voice heard from, sensitivity of connecting the existing context, being built at a time really when heroic independent architecture was the norm. Somehow in his brilliance, Mr. Pei was able to accomplish both at the same time. And with your gracious help, I would like you to help welcome Mr. Pei.
Obviously. I did not come here to speak. Really. I mean it. I came here for two reasons. One, to see what I did wrong. And Ed Bacon already told me. The second reason is to come to say hello to my client, David Krivinier. David came to see me about this museum. How long ago? Must be 65, 66, around that time. And I already knew there was a Saturn building there. So, you know, when you are like me, second generation architect, Saturn name means a lot, or meant a lot to me. So I almost accepted that challenge right then, at that time. Now, let me reflect a little bit. Because I belong to the second generation of modern architects, I think I can say I've known most of them, personally. Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, Aalto, Breuer, Gropius, all of them. But I've never met Elio Saarinen. That is a bit surprising. And like you two, you know them intimately. Not at all, I didn't. But I had the good fortune of following his footsteps twice. The first one is Des Moines, and I did something there. I hope, out of great respect for the man, and you didn't think so. I wanted to complete the circuit. That's all, because you have... But how can you complete the circuit without blocking the view? Impossible. So the Des Moines Art Center is not like the campus of University of Virginia. So I did just that. The second time I followed him came much later. David, you don't know that. And this was in Columbus, Indiana. I think Mr. Papademetriou, is that the way I pronounce it? Show a photograph of a church designed by Elio Saarinen with a tower. Right. I was asked to put a library next to it, which I did. Again, I never met the man.
Across the street.
Across the street, yes. So therefore, I came here to, again, pay my respect to him. Now, these three generations of architects that you touch on, I think it's quite interesting in a way, because the first generation obviously started modern architecture. And those of us who follow the second generation try to digest what they have taught us and try to develop something on our own. I think the third generation, they have greater confidence. They did their own, or they're doing their own thing. So that's the difference. So with that, I conclude, and I'm going to save time for you to ask questions. Thank you very much.
To begin that process, and you're invited all to come down in the audience and come to one of the two microphones in front and ask your questions and or share your stories. If any of you have had observations or stories to tell about the Art Center and its evolution over the years, please come and share them with us. But to begin the process, Mr. David Kreidnier, who was one of the co-people responsible for selecting Mr. Pei, has a little story to tell to get the thing rolling.
Well, back in 1965, the Art Center received a grant of $500,000 for a sculpture court. And so we needed an architect, and another trustee, Jim Schramm, and I were designated to find an architect. And so, I don't think you know this, you weren't our first choice. We went to the Saturn firm, and they were too busy, and they turned us down. And so Jim and I were out in the street, and we hadn't done too much advanced planning, but we'd done a little reading, and one of us said, you know, there's an architect out there named I.M. Pei. We don't know anything about him, but he's gotten some very good reviews, and shall we give him a shot? And so we went to the pay phone on the street. This is true, and called him, and said, can we come up? We have a project we think you might be interested in. He wasn't so busy then. He said, come on up. And so up we went, and we had with us a few 8x10 glossy photos of the Saturn building, and we had a copy of the blueprints, and that's all. And so we sat down. He said, well, let's see, Des Moines, Iowa. Where is that? And he said, tell me about this building. And he looked at these photos. He said, Saturn. I know of Saturn's work. What is this? What is this out? Where is it located? And we told him, and they said, what is this out here? And we said, there's a rose garden out to the south. And he said, what is this stone that's made of? And we said, well, this is a Wisconsin Lannon stone. So he mulled it over for about 3 minutes, and then he sat down at his table and got out some tracing paper, and he put it on top of the blueprints. He said, well, let's see where this should go. He said, $500,000, that's plenty of money for a sculpture court. So he said, look at this building. It dead ends here. It's got two... Everybody who goes in here has to turn around and come back out through these front doors. He says, I think we'll put this building right here. And he connected these two ends and proceeded to draw the building. And he said, let's see, this building shouldn't look just like the Saturn building. The building should represent its time. This is 20 years later. He said, we'll take this stone and we'll just grind it up into in some kind of an aggregate, and we'll have the same color, and it should, whatever we do, should be compatible with the past and be a good neighbor. And he said, to make the aggregate a little more interesting, I think we can design some kind of a machine to give it some texture, this bush hammering you see out there. And let's see, he said, out here, we got this rose garden. We'll put some big windows. And he said, this reflecting pool, we'll leave that, but we'll maybe change it just a little bit. And we walked out of there half an hour later, and oh my God, we've got a building. And I have never, ever seen the creative mind at work the way it was that day in my lifetime. So that's the beginning.
I believe that was one of the earliest versions of free architectural sketches, I think. With that in mind, you obviously impressed Mr. Kreidner with your ability to come to grips with the problem at hand so quickly. And in your video on the Miho Museum, you had a very strong statement about how the site was such a critical part of the program, and you really needed to visit it to have a sense. After your initial response to Mr. Kreidner, when you finally got to come to Des Moines, how did that change your reaction to those original thoughts?
You mean about completing Saturn? Oh no, I thought I was right. Something had to be done. Because you see, Ed, the weather here in the winter is pretty strong, very, very cold. And when you get to the end of that gallery, and then you say, my gosh, you now have to go outdoors again and then come back in. People don't do that. They didn't. So therefore, I thought, after having talked to you, I guess you reminded me of that, and I thought it was something that had to be done. Now, as far as the stone is concerned, the London stone, I already tried that idea out in Colorado about 5 or 6 years ago. You remember that? Did you go out to see the Colorado? No. Well, see, there we have to build a research center on a mesa where the backdrop is the Rocky Mountains. And it's very, very difficult to manage that kind of building because Air Force Academy, have tried one way, and that is to make the building a la mise, so to speak, to be distinct from nature, to separate from nature, and therefore it can be just what it turned out to be. At that time, a year before, 2 years before, I went to see that, and I thought that there might be another way to try to deal with that problem. I want to lead that up to the London stone. So I went to see Mesa Verdes, where the Indians built the huge caves. And I say, my gosh, they found a way to deal with the mountains, because they built it just like the mountain. Well, no, I can't do that. I can't create mountain. So therefore, what we tried is, if we could only get some of that stone from the mountain and grind it up, and then put it back into the building, and then give it a texture, maybe the two will blend. Well, we did just that. Having done that before coming to here, I thought maybe there's a way that I could do a building of our time, as you say, of our time, but at the same time, blend with the old. I think in 1960s, at that time, we were very concerned about context at that time, more so than perhaps today. And when you see a building that's done by an architect you respect, and you have to add to it, somehow you have to pay some respect to that. And I think the use of that stone, the aggregate of that stone, was my way of saying that Saturn, I tried to do something that will blend and mix. I think today, we do less of that now. And then another thing which we also try, that is to create space. I think the first generation architects, with the exception of Le Corbusier, I would say, have paid less attention to space than they should. I think that is a missing part that those of us who came along, the second generation that came along,
felt there's a need somehow to do something with space, three-dimensional space. Mies University, Illinois, you've written so well, so much about it. I think I went there many, many times before, a long time ago, and I somehow found that I came away not being satisfied.
I like them.
I know, I know that. I came away feeling that there was something missing there, as far as I'm concerned. Now, the ones that came along, in fact, before my time, I think it's Lucan. Lucan came along and provided a way. Lucan's your neighbor, was your neighbor, and provided an interesting alternative to the Bauhaus and to the Miesian approach to modern architecture.
Well, could I speak about Lucan? Lucan lived in Philadelphia, and it was my idea when I became director of the City Planning Commission in Philadelphia that I would do the dirty work and get the underground railroads and everything else, and as the architecture rose up into the sky, it would be Lucan, and I asked him to work with me. And I was dealing with a situation with no client and no program. And Lou kept saying, wouldn't it be nice to put a little thing here, a little thing there? And it was obstructing the communication of the basic idea. And it is true that Lucan, in the whole of Center City, Philadelphia, despite all the work he did, doesn't have a single shred of influence on what actually happened. And I do think that it raises the issue of whether the architectural profession really can respond to the responsibilities necessary when you're building a city.
You would agree, however, that Kahn and the Kimball building does achieve the spatial ends that you are after.
No, that's true.
And as far as Mies is concerned, and this is obviously not about Mies this afternoon, but he did have his own unique idea about space, which is one of the reasons why he began that whole clear span pavilion idea that was part of his American period, which is, I think, most eloquently achieved in the Farnsworth House.
It's, if you look at Richard Meyer's building, which I did for the first time today, some people may not like it, but I think the spatial play inside is quite exciting. I find it very nice.
It's the first time you've seen it?
The first time I saw it, yes.
Well, the spatial play inside the Mies building is exciting, but if you really...
Richard
Meyer, I'm sorry, what did I say? Never mind. But you take Saturn, and his galleries are so completely responsive. You take yours are magnificent, and they are a whole step beyond his because they are art themselves, which his doesn't even try to be. But I really think that Richard lets architecture run away with him, because as I just look back on his buildings, I think of railings, I think of stairways and so forth and so on, but where's the art?
It's hung all over the place.
You might want to know, Mr. Meyer is not here to defend himself. We certainly did give him that opportunity many, many, many times, but he was not able to make it. One of the things I think that we're referring to a little bit is the notion of the evolution, of the design goals, through the course of a project. Obviously, Mr. Saturn had his, set of goals and what was critical, and then, Mr. Paez articulated his, revised set of goals as he began to understand the problem. And is there any other discussion that anybody wants to have about that whole kind of evolution that took place in this process?
Well, I certainly do. I want to point out that you are probably about the nuttiest people in the whole world, because who in the world except you would combine these astounding group of people? And the issues, I mean, after all, we have an honest-to-goodness argument about architecture, and that is a rare thing. That what you have here is a very, very precious thing, because if you really analyze the relationship of these things together, they're incredibly complex, but it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And I really recommend to you that you get a very, very good scholar of some kind to make a very careful analysis of the whole history of this. And I think that it's very important, too, the influence of the board. Because, of course, originally I blamed the board entirely on forcing Yo-Ming to cut off that view. Because they wanted to keep the kids out of the swimming pool. But I really do feel that, well, I feel in a very serious way that what you have done is most extremely extraordinary. And I simply say for myself that usually I can solve problems instantly, but I'm so darn confused what you did, it's a new experience.
A minute. I was head of the architecture selection committee that selected Meyer, but I want you to know that we went back to I am Pei. And somehow I am at lost interest in doing further work in Des Moines. And so we had to go to somebody else. That's how it happened.
We call that sequence serendipitous genius, I believe. Please, again, if anybody has comments during the whole conversation, please just walk on down to the microphone and go ahead and ask any questions or add any comments that you wish. You had just articulated the special uniqueness, of this place. I mean, are there really any comparable kinds of places around? I mean, that where you're dealing with almost more than three equals than.
Well, I know of nothing like it at all, and I really came here feeling rather cynical, but I'm totally fascinated.
I think the only example emerging as we speak is in Houston, Texas, where the Museum of Fine Arts was originally designed by William Ward Watkin, who was a protege of Ralph Adams Cram, having done the Rice University campus master planning and early buildings. And then Mies van der Rohe added on to the museum and redefined the entrance to the museum because times had changed. There were many other pressures. And then Mies added on to himself yet again in the third stage. And now there's a building being completed by Raphael Mineo, which is right next to the existing building. And so there's a kind of trilogy happening there as well.
There's another example too, of course, which is the Museum of Modern Art.
Right.
Where you have the Edward Durrell Stone building, and then a couple of buildings by Philip Johnson, and then the Caesar Pelli edition, and finally the one that's going up now in the old Dorset Hotel by Taniguchi or whatever.
Taniguchi.
Yeah. I
don't think any of those are as good as this, by the way.
Well, I think one of the issues is the idea of style versus other principles. I mean, to what extent is style an issue as we look at the organic nature of any kind of changing form, whether it's a city or a single building? We talk about continuities of scale, buildings that have common vocabularies that we're very comfortable with, say like Back Bay Boston or Central Philadelphia, the townhouse districts and so on, row house districts. How do you confront a situation where there has been a kind of logarithmic curve and change in the 20th century, and you have here a man, Eliel Saarinen, born in 1873, doing a building in 1948, then having buildings done 2 decades later and 2 decades later, and we know that the rate of change in terms of the nature of the institution itself. I mean, I don't think that anybody connected with the formation of the Des Moines arts groups envisioned, when they first talked about doing a $300,000 building, what they would ultimately be headed toward. And there's the question of what happens in the future. Is Meyer a closing of the story, or is it potentially a future chapter to be written by someone else? In fact, I think that's really the fascinating thing. Are there principles of composition and strategic ideas that have to do with the planning of an organic kind of enterprise that changes over time, that can respond to both the existing and project the future? And still, how can we separate that from issues of style, which might be very localized? Because what might seem controversial now might seem really kind of comfortable years from now, as a matter of fact, even in a building such as Des Moines, where there are such clear signature pieces.
Well, I'd like to relate a little incidents that happened as a member of the building committee, Dave Crider's building committee during the Meyer planning process. There's a very different way of approaching the problem and solution than Mr. Pei indicated when he talked to Jim Schramm and Dave Crider. Mr. Pei listened to what they had to say and looked at the building plans. Mr. Meyer, on the other hand, would come to the building committee meetings scheduled for an hour and a half on a Friday afternoon. We all knew when he had to depart for the airport. And there would be lots of chit-chat. He would keep the conversation going and ask questions about what was happening in Des Moines and want to know everything he could. Then in the last 15 minutes, almost as he was packing up his briefcase, he would roll out his plans and tell the committee what they were going to have.
I learned something from new technique in discussion.
I do want to put one. Oh, go ahead.
To go back in time a little bit more, 1947 to 49, I was studying at the University of Michigan, but Edmund Saturn was my mentor in Cranbrook, and I had a fortune in visiting him about once a month, spending Saturday afternoon. He had just completed and published his second book, which was A Search for Form. It was very nice to hear about the trees, which is one of his favorite books. But he died when he was 50 or so, and that's why they couldn't have him back for the first edition. But he was a very personable person, as far as I was. He was kind of a father figure for me. While Darrow was a little bit more reticent and wasn't, because Darrow had spoken Swedish with his mother at home. So I spoke Finnish or English, and it was a little bit more awkward. But Bob Swanson, who was the brother-in-law, Darrow and Bob were very angry at each other. The last time I saw them together was in Ariel's funeral. It was Chipson's, I remember, was Bob's wife and Ariel's sister, and she had her mark in the architecture also, in the interior colors particularly, and working with Florence Knoll and some of the Chalcees and so on. You guys are sitting on some. And I was really stricken when Herbert died. I was in Upper Peninsula, and I had to stop the car and cry because it was so dramatic that day. But this area always, his architecture was contemporary. He did not take the modern aspect that. But anyway, I really treasure those days back then. Throughout the time when this art center came about.
Mr. Pei, I taught a number of years ago at Louvre University, Taiwan, which was a beautiful chapel. At that place, you have to worry about things like earthquakes.
Yes.
Soaring beautiful building. A couple of quick questions. One, at least until recently, there were streets on the windows facing south near Richmond, and I wondered whether that is...
Donghai?
No, here in the north.
Oh, here.
The Art Center, And I wondered whether that was possibly caused by some mistake the construction contractor made. And
No, I don't.
Quick question is,
Yes.
what about Richard Serra's stones outside and the idea of maybe putting sculpture around the building? What do you think of that? Is that a good idea or bad?
I can't answer the second question. I don't know somebody else who had to do that, but I have to accept responsibility for those cracks. We have learned that expansion and contraction we really should have had more expansion joints. I learned that, and that's and it just opened up. Now today I walked through the building with Mr. Crichton, and I saw some leaks coming through. Now, if I were Frank Lloyd Wright, I would say put a bucket underneath it, but I don't have, I just couldn't bring myself to saying that. But that is a problem. I'm embarrassed by it. But fortunately, those things can be fixed. If you see cracks, stain on the outside is one thing. Cracks on the outside, it's much more serious. I think cracks, leaks coming through from the roof could be fixed, and I think they'll be all right. But today is not a very good day because I couldn't go outside to look at it. I would have liked to do so. But usually, a concrete building looks terrible after rain, and really it does. And you can't beat natural stone that way. But there's certain satisfaction you get from something that's monolithic, like nature. Try to build it just like the way nature makes things. But there are limitations, and that I've learned.
There's a little point I'd like to inject, if I could, that when you look at Saarinen's first design, it was a kind of a temple up on a big stairway and an entirely different kind of thing. But that, I think, was where the client came in, and the client was the one that convinced him to go in a different direction. And this, I think, was a very creative interrelationship between client and architect. But don't forget, the clients are very important too.
Very, very important. Yes, absolutely.
I'm an architect from the University of Cincinnati, so I've had an opportunity to see a lot of additions pop up later. For example, I've had to live with the Eisman addition for about the last 2 years. Gray's built a building there. Venture's got a dormitory going up soon. Gary's got a medical arts building. A couple more buildings, basically. And I've had the opportunity to see the relationship between existing buildings and the ones that are currently going up at the moment. And I'm wondering, since Saarinen never got the opportunity to see the actual addition that was added on by you, what is your feeling of then seeing your building added on to by Meyer? The relationship between the two buildings, whether you thought you respected some of your forms and maybe some of the shapes and materials that were both in your building and in Saarinen's.
I was a little surprised by that design when I first saw it published. How long ago? 10 years ago. And I became a little concerned as to how the two were joined together. But now that I've seen it for the first time, I'm a little less shocked by it. I think the contact between his building and the Saarinen and my building were made rather lightly, with a small building which is a cafeteria or something like that, a restaurant. But his building actually stands apart as he wanted it. So therefore, it's a signature building, and I think that's the only way he knows how to do it. I'm with no, not implied as a criticism, but that's the kind of architecture that he does, and it would be difficult to meld them together. But with Saarinen, I tried. I think that is a difference. I might not have succeeded, but it was consciously I tried to make it compatible, let's put it this way. But that's a difference. That's a difference of one generation.
I'd like to say something. I'd like to throw something in for Mr. Pei. I mean, he's sort of victimized being here, but I'm sort of curious from any of the Iowans that have lived here for a number of years, to what extent the connection to Greenwood Park was used as a gateway to the museum at all. Whether, I mean, the spatial connection that Ed Bacon spoke about is an obvious one that I would have liked to have seen myself. The only chance I'll get to see it is with some virtual reality demonstrations at Iowa State University, which was quite an extraordinary experience, where they recreated the building in 1948 as a virtual reality experience. But I don't know to what extent people actually used Greenwood Park as a gateway to the museum in those days, to what extent the entrances were accessible from the Greenwood Park side at all. I've been talking to some of the curators, and there is no photograph from that period that shows the courtyard in a relationship to the formal garden. And that seems extraordinary to me, that someone wouldn't have felt strong enough to at least document that, because there are many photographs from 1948, but none that show that.
Well, I do think it must also be added that it's a very extraordinary thing that Saturn respected so much.
Yeah.
That single line that was defined by nothing but a bunch of roses. And it's very extraordinary for an architect to do that.
Yeah, that shows in the model, but I don't know whether it was actually experienced in reality in 1948.
Well, there were those pylons too, of course.
That were, that marched out into the...
Marched out.
Marched out. I mean, Mr. Pay's building does give you a generous view as a surprise as you get inside. I, for one, feel two things about the Meyer building. Well, three things maybe. I think it's a little jittery, number one. I mean, it makes me nervous. And second is, I think the fire stair as a visual element as you approach the entrance to the center today is a bit of a visual disaster, as being a main thing that you would see for the Meyer building. It's like kind of seeing your underpants or something in public. And the third thing is that the building does, while the Pay building does acknowledge the garden and captures the view visually, I had no sense of Polk coming into, that axis of Polk coming into Grand Avenue as having anything to do with the Meyer building, and that seems like a real shame. If you look historically back in the early schemes by John Brooks of Brooks Borg, that axis of Polk is recognized, and it's sort of suggested in terms of the placement of the Saarinen wing. It's a disappointment to me that from inside the Meyer building that you don't somehow recapture that relationship to that axis of Polk that comes into Grand, which seems a real urbanistic failure.
And I would like to just add to that the opposite, that if you look at what Saarinen did, the incredible serenity, the incredible courage to simply use continuous horizontal lines as really your whole design is very extraordinary.
I'd just like to say something to Mr. Pay. In 1971, my family moved here from the East Coast, and I started a new school. I'm sorry, 1971. I can't hear you so well, miss. Will you please speak?
When you're talking to the microphone?
In 1971, my family moved here from the East Coast, and I started a new school. And I was given an art scholarship at the Art Center to go every Saturday. And I was 7, that was 1971. And from that time, I always loved drawing. And I used to, after class, hide there. They really didn't want to go home. And the circular stair, when I was a child, I thought that was for the kids, and the straight stair was for the adults. And I used to sit there and look at the rose garden, and then eventually, you end up out there as a kid. But now, years later, I have children of my own, and they're about the age I was when I would go down there. And I find that we go down the straight stair, and they run up and down the circular. So I guess my question was, even though I think that's not the reality, I always wondered if that was why you did it. It's a great place to hide. And secondly, I was getting a lot of grief for closing off the two ends, and the other, it's impossible to run around and avoid your parents if the corridor dead ends. You can be in the Art Center perpetually and never get caught. So I thank you very much for what I just thought was a wonderful addition, and I'm very happy that I got this opportunity to thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, I grew up in Michigan and still have a grandfather who's living in an original Frank Lloyd Wright home. About 45 years ago, he commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to come to Kalamazoo, Michigan and build a home for my father's family and for some other friends. And he tells great stories of working with Frank Lloyd Wright and also admires a lot of your architecture. And I'm just wondering how Frank Lloyd Wright may have influenced your thinking over the years. Or maybe some of the other speakers would also comment on how he may have briefly influenced some of the other great architects.
I don't think any architect today can say that he is not influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. I would say here's one architect. He doesn't have a style that is easily imitated. No question about that. It's not like Mies or like Le Corbusier. Very, very difficult. But everyone is influenced by him. His sense of space is incredible. It really is. It's very hard to it's sort of, you go into his building, it may leak, but it's a wonderful feeling. It really is. But I learned a lot from him. But it's very difficult, and there's no reason to imitate his style. Stylistically, I think one doesn't have to learn. One has to learn the essence within that particular style. And I think in that sense, he's very important influence to me.
I'd like to speak to this very question that Yao-Ming talked about, the essence of it. That in my opinion, the early residences that Frank Lloyd Wright did with offset axes is almost a new creation of architecture. And it's a whole concept, just like the great Baroque idea of the parallel. And that we haven't really grasped hold of it and understood it, because I think that if we really understood it, even our city planning would become much more elegant and meaningful.
Well, there's something else too. There's of course that whole notion of the open plan that Wright brought during the Prairie style, and that had a great deal of influence upon the Europeans, Mies especially. He admitted this candidly and carried it forward, as a matter of fact. But the influence was very strong there, and Mies, as a matter of fact, respected Wright very, very greatly until they had a falling out.
Everybody had a falling out. I think that Eliel Saarinen probably put it best because Frank Lloyd Wright had a love-hate relationship with most people, and he was once asked what he thought about Frank Lloyd Wright, and Eliel Saarinen says that he is always frank, but not often right.
That's a wonderful
One of the things that was discussed in the video about Neo was the concept of the combination of Eastern culture and Western technology, and wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that's influenced your work.
I don't know whether anybody knows anything about Miho. Some of you might have seen the film. But that's not a very important part of that Miho. I think the important thing to look at is really the spiritual dimension of this particular piece of work. I'm not saying it's something I created, not at all. It's something that comes from the client. It's a religious organization for whom I have to work, and they're extremely concerned about somehow making this place as a place that is detached from the world. Now, Shangri-La is not a good word to explain that, but that is really the one thing that they want most of all. Whether you do it with Western technology or anything like that, it's not important to them. So, and that actually, I don't know how many of you have seen the film, but the important thing that I've learned from that one is that when I was talking to them about that wish of theirs, and they've chosen a site that actually is impossible to get to. There's no way to get to that site. And because they were so concerned about that one thing, that made me remember a Chinese essay that was written in 4th century. Here's a gentleman sitting here that may know Tao Yuanming. Yeah. They were written in 4th century about a fisherman who came upon this little hole in the mountain and walked into it and found a new world. Now, what I tried to do here, when I explained that essay, that story, the client in this case is an old lady. She was then 80-some years old. Once she heard that, she jumped up and clapped her hands. Said, "That's what I want." And with that encouragement, I pointed to the hill across the way. I said, "If we could only drive a hole through that hill, you can get here." And from that point on, there was never any doubt in her mind that that's what she wanted. And she had to buy that hill in order to make this possible.
That's the Eastern culture part?
Eastern culture part. But where the structure is Western, modern, contemporary, it's not important. It really isn't that important.
Question, do you think that Meyer followed that attack that you did when he did the Getty, in that you have to take that journey to get to the Getty? Do you think he followed your idea at all?
Oh, no, it's very different. Getty, the only other way you can get there other than what he had is to drop down from the sky. I think that's, of course, is. I haven't been there since it opened. I was told it's impossible to find a parking space.
It's one of the good things about Des Moines. I have not a very significant question, but it's one that's puzzled me. I know it's puzzled a lot of us over the years. It's the old wives' tale or rumor that you actually incorporated your signature into the Des Moines Art Center on the south elevation.
Gosh, no.
As you look at next time any of you go to the south elevation of the Des Moines Art Center, you'll see very symbolically with the circular stair an image of a P, 3 horizontal lines with an image of an E, and a far right-hand bold vertical stroke with the image of an I. And I've always thought it was true that he was very subtle, but we found out today that that's
that goes.
What advice would you give to students? What do you say to students and teachers?
Gentlemen, interest for each other, and you have a chance to get together.
No, it's the best that I've seen in a long time.
Coming up again, but I had intended to give my memories about Time and Fate, because when I was a young architect, I collected pictures from the magazines, and there was a young architect somewhere by the name of Time and Fate who worked for a fellow by the name of Secondor. And I would fill these magazines apart because 90% were ads, and I would say I had a plan of I don't know how many buildings I had a line day, but it was really wonderful to have this opportunity. And when you were asking about the cultural difference, well, go to Hong Kong and the United States out there. There's a technology in the middle of the Eastern philosophy.
Thank you. Hong Kong actually is more Western than Eastern. Otherwise, I wouldn't have built such a tall building there. No, I wouldn't do it in Beijing. No, nor would you.
In today's society, where disposable is the main key point, and things have limited spans, what do you feel architects can do to promote a longer generation to extend their ideas, much like the ancient Greeks and Romans, whose architecture has lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years and still today. What do you think architects can do to keep that?
Oh, answer. Somebody may want to answer that one. They're more qualified to do so, but
Well, I would say for one thing that the materials that they used back then were long-lasting, and we use disposable materials right now. And many of the buildings that have been going up in the last 50 years are not aging well, so it has a great deal to do with materials. That's one answer.
I think the quality of the design is also very important. I have an experience which I will recount to you. At MIT in Cambridge, I participated in commissioning 2 works of art at different times to different artists. The first one is Calder, and the second one is Louise Nevelson. These 2 pieces were sited only within 500 feet of each other. And they're all black, both of them. One, Calder piece, remained just the way it always has been. But the Nevelson piece was always full of graffiti. Now, I'm not a person that can judge art saying that is a better artist than the other one, but that has something to do with it. The permanence of one thing depends on how people look at it. If the work of architecture in this case is designed badly or shoddily built with the wrong kind of material, it won't last, it will go. The only chance hope for somehow survival, let's put it this way, in a disposable society, is really the architect would have tried to do something as well as he can so that it has a chance to be respected and kept. That's all.
But this was a wonderful question for a young man to ask, and I think it's very important that the profession take it very, very seriously.
Thank you. With that, I think I will give the panel an opportunity to kind of conclude, their remarks for the day, and start with Mr. Schultz.
Well, I'll be very, very brief. I said what I meant to say, and I think what has been said here pretty much confirmed it. That this is a remarkable trio of buildings that work together very, very well, but the individual architects who did them did not lose their own identity. That's the point that I made. And the rest of it is, as I said, to take great pleasure in listening to Mr. Pei and Mr. Bacon and Mr. Papademetriou, but especially this wonderful, wonderful conflict over here. Best I've heard.
Well, I would just like to add that I think that buildings are really mirrors of ourselves. Buildings are mirrors of the society that make them, that fund them, that take them through the whole process of debate and design, construction and occupation. If the buildings are going to have a longevity, it's because they still have a cultural resonance to the occupants of the society that built them. The Des Moines Art Center is a repository for art and an institution to study culture and art, ever-changing, moving around, new things happening all the time. And the buildings that were built represented the efforts of various elements of the Des Moines society to articulate what that might be. And I think that the thing we have to look at when we look at buildings, when we look at cities, is how do we see our future in our past? How do we see our future in our present? And what can we do about binding those two things together?
Well, I can only say that it's been a wonderful thing in my life to have association with you, Ian.
Thank you. Oh, that's very nice to say. I have only one thing to add to what has already been said, and there's so much have already been said today that I want to thank you all for coming in such a terrible day. The weather's but I think the one thing I do want to say is that it's never said enough and that is the importance of the client. Behind every successful building, I don't have that many that I've done, there was a client behind it. And he or she is extremely important, and I don't think architects should make light of that. This is one thing I want to tell the young architects here. Before you accept a commission, look at your client.